I think the first thing I should say is that although Dr. Sajida says it's important where you die rather than where you were born, since I'm not dead yet, I will say that I was born in Penang Island in Malaysia. And Penang Island is a place where we have many Tamil Muslims, we have Malabari Muslims, we also have Chinese from China, and we have Malays from Malaya. So it is very much a melting pot, a place where many different diasporic groups converge. And I must say that in Malabar, I feel very at home because we have so many different groups and some coming from abroad as well, converging. In Penang, we have things like Appam and Buntu, Paratha, but not as good, not as thin as in Calicut. But the Paratha, we call it Roti Canai. I'm not sure why. You have to discuss it with your Tamil friends. But we call it. We think of globalization, colonialism as taking place. But really, if you go to a place like Calicut, it was already shaped by these inter-Asian connections even before the Portuguese came. So this is something which I'm very interested in thinking about, to learn, research and learn about these inter-Asian relations which started before the Portuguese came, which actually continued, especially under the British, in terms of international trade and migration. It took a bit of a hit with nationalism, but with globalization it goes up again. So this back and forth connection, closing up, reconnection is something which over the long historical period we see. If we only take the Vasco da Gama period, we see that everything is run or interpreted by the Europeans. So to me, that is something which is still a big problem for us. In scholarship, we still look to the West. We want international connections to the West, but really, that misses out on the long interconnections between different parts of the East. So this is something which I found when I came to Malabar. I came to Malabar second time during the first Kerala Islamic Muslim Conference, History Conference in 2013. And I met people, students, scholars who were very keen to discuss these interchanges across the ocean. JALEEL, ABDUL PKM was one of these. And then when I went to Leiden one year, I think 2012, I met Dr. Mahmoud Kuria, who was then not yet a doctor. And somehow I found that we had very good interchange and there was a lot of common interests we shared, but at the time we didn't really develop them yet. So over the past few years, I have gotten to know Dr. Abdul Jaleel, Mahmoud Kuria, and also Dr. Nisha Matthew, and I found my relationship discussions with them very fruitful and very intense. So the main thing that we can contribute to international scholarship is using native sources. And by native, I don't mean of one place. By native, I mean native of the whole region or trans-region of the Indian Ocean and of Asia, between East and West Asia. So my own work has involved studying the Hadarim from Hadramaut to East Africa, South Asia and Southeast Asia. And from this, I have some insight into the kinds of relations and the depth of the relations between these different parts of Asia. And in the past 10 years, I've been working on something called Inter-Asia, which takes this idea of using materials from Asia and studying the long interconnections. The thing about Inter-Asia is that it is very rich and deep compared to globalization. Globalization has made us all want to go international, global, and so on, but really the material is very thin, mostly from the 19th century onwards, and contemporary internet and these sorts of things. But if you look at Inter-Asia, it goes much deeper. And part of the reason is that it is not the whole globe, it is more humble, it is only a trans-region, West Asia to East Asia via South Asia. And the other thing about this trans-region is that people have actually moved across this space for many centuries. And when they move, they actually then create materials like silsilas, like food, like family histories, like political histories, trade. So all these movements of people actually generate what we scholars call data. So we have a very important treasure trove of data right under our noses, which we do not make enough use of. So I think that there is a lot of opportunity for people from Malabar to take advantage of these materials to investigate the long history of inter-ocean connections. And this actually, to me, is the next wave of scholarship in Asian studies. And we have sitting here Dr. Mahmoud Kuria, who has now written a fabulous book on the Shafi'i Islamic law in the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean. And his book uses manuscripts in Malay, in Arabic, in Malayalam, and so on. And this is exactly the kind of scholarship I'm talking about, that you can use these sources in 3-4 different languages from across the region and tie things together in a way which the Western scholars have no idea about. The Western scholars, and I include Chaudhry. Chaudhry was one of the founders of Indian Ocean Studies, but he used English East India sources. So, sources which come out of European experience and engagement. So that he was able to start this field, but the limitation of the data from English sources means that many things you can't see. So if you use Arabic, Malayali, Malay sources, you can see a different view of the world. And I think that is very important. And that is something which people in Malabar, in Yemen, in Malaysia have a comparative advantage on. So if you take people from these areas and they work in good universities like PSMO, they work in Leiden University and other universities, they can combine these different skills and languages and so on, and actually become the top world-class scholars today. So with this generation, we now see people from Malabar being top world-class scholars, also from Singapore, Malaysia, India, the Gulf, and so on. So I think there's a big opportunity here, and I'm happy that BSMO College is grabbing this opportunity. So I'm very happy to be here as part of this movement. We've heard a lot of talk about connections between different places. Today I want to do something different. I want to look at one place within a network of connections and to see how these external connections can actually shape the society in one place. And the one place I've chosen today is, I'm a bit afraid, Calicut. And Calicut, why? Because Calicut was one place which was the center of globalization. This is why the Portuguese came to Calicut. So Calicut has a very important role in Asian history as the first place where the European empires started. But as I said, we already had a lot of relations before the Portuguese came. And the Portuguese came precisely because we had all these relations, because Calicut was the center of global trade at that time. So that's why the Portuguese came. What does it mean, or what does Calicut society look like at that time when it was a center of world trade? So this is the topic of my talk today, and of course I'm not from Calicut, so I expect a lot of criticism and correction, and I hope to learn from the audience today. So the past few decades have seen great enthusiasm for global studies on the back of globalization, global supply chains, the peace dividend from the end of the Cold War divide. China opened up and began co-producing and trading with the capitalist countries of East and Southeast Asia. So what we call intra-Asian trade, trade between Asian countries, surpassed extra-Asian trade, that is trade with Europe and the West, at the beginning of the 21st century. The renewed ability to cross borders that had been closed for a whole generation or more sparked the imaginations of tourists and scholars alike, and a new line of inter-Asian studies took off, together with new budget airlines crisscrossing Asia. I think I came from Singapore on Vistara, which is a collaboration between Tata and Singapore Airlines. So this is the sort of thing I'm talking about. So if we take a long view, or the long view, the divisions of the Cold War over decades, colonialism over centuries, these have been the exception. Peoples and places across Asia have been connected to one another since before the advent of European colonialism. Indeed, the connections were so deep and extensive, they shaped the very places and societies which stood at the nodal points of such connections. Since you have so kindly invited me to Malabar today, I thought I would shift our attention away from the connections to focus on a single nodal point, a point where East, Southeast, and South Asia intersected with one another, and with Arabia and East Africa as well. From all these places into Malabar. I call this a view from the outside in, from the Indian Ocean into Malabar. Malabar was already a famous place, hosting inter-Asian connections as an emporium port in the Indian Ocean, when the Portuguese landed there at the beginning of the 16th century. Arabs, Jews, Chinese, Christians, Persians, and others were coming, going, and settling. There were also the various castes and categories glossed under the umbrella term Hindu today. Malabar was the sort of place that we today call plural or multicultural. The Portuguese arrival in Malabar was historic. It was the beginning of half a millennium of European colonialism in Asia, what Panikar called the Vasco da Gama era. It also sparked what seems to be a strange response, a call to armed jihad against them, written in a book entitled Gift of the Jihad Warriors, or Tuhfat al-Mujahideen fi Ba'd al-Ahwal al-Portugaliyin, issuing from a place that was so plural and so multicultural. How was that possible? The book is also strange in other ways. It is one of the earliest anthropological studies we know of anywhere in the world, detailing with great precision the customary practices of various groups in Malabar. So it is maybe even like the Malabar Hortus Botanicus of Malabar. Very old, solid academic work. It is also one of the earliest histories of Malabar, recounting the origin of dynasties, the arrival of Islam in the region, and the beginning of the colonial encounter across Asia and the Indian Ocean. It is also a book of law, written by a Muslim jurist, Zain ad-Din al-Malibari or Makhdum al-Saghir, giving exhaustive justification for jihad. Above all, it is strange in having all these different fields represented in less than 100 pages. In short, it is what we call a multidisciplinary study today. How did al-Malibari end up writing a multidisciplinary study so early on, and why? The sort of society al-Malibari was writing about, mobile, trans-regional, multicultural, multi-religious, Creole, that is intermixed, oceanic, was not the sort of society Western social theories were made for. It was inter-Asian. I will discuss why Western theory could not understand such an inter-Asian society. In such a society, groups could claim purity, be pure, be expressly different from each other. Hindu, Muslim, Brahmin, Nayar, and so on. So they could be very different from each other, but yet tied to each other with moral bonds that make them and their very purity interdependent on each other. Their very purity was dependent on others. So this is a strange thing. It is in such a society that a call to jihad could attempt to marshal non-Muslims to its side. Sounds strange to our ears today, but let's jump in. Malabar, so as you know, is a region on the southwest coast of India, on the rim of the Indian Ocean. Such places have been connected with each other in continuous interaction over centuries. In its leading port cities, almost everybody, it seemed, had a touch of the foreign. Foreigners did not only come to trade, they intermarried with locals and produced offspring who had parents from different countries, languages, cultures, and religions. In anthropology, we call such a phenomenon hybridity. The hybrid emerges out of contact across cultures in a third separate entity produced by interaction between the two. This notion of hybrid, also called Creole, draws from social linguistics, in which the Creole is a developed, stable language in its own right, with its own grammar, as opposed to a pidgin, which disappears when cross-cultural contact ceases. Creoles reproduce and persist even after the contact ends. Now, if we scan the Indian Ocean, we see that societies around its coastal rim have something of the hybrid of Creole in them. So we have, in East Africa, we call communities Swahili. In Malabar, we say Mapila. In Southeast Asia, we say Peranakan. So across the whole Indian Ocean, we see these kinds of communities. If we look closely at these communities, none of them escapes the touch of the cover. Societies in this oceanic region have been formed by contact with the outside world. Over the long term, this contact has been ceaseless and continues unimpeded today, even stronger with relations to the Gulf, for example. Now, the imperial networks actually added to it, but national independence cut it down. Post-Cold War globalization brought it back. So the colonial period was simply one permutation of this constant mixing of peoples. The mobility enabled by the ocean's waters constantly stirred the cross-cultural port. Repeated cycles of mobility in the old days, timed with the biannual turning of the monsoons, created circulations between different nodes around the ocean, and at each of these nodes, hybrids and creoles emerged and reproduced as the circulations fed a constant process of cross-cultural contact. That is to say, foreigners always arrive, and as they consorted with locals, they produced offspring. So eventually, these foreigners ascended to the status of ancestors. What this means is that viewed through the eyes of a Swahili, Mapila, or Peranakan person, long dead ancestors and recently arrived foreigners were persons of the same category. Ancestors and recent migrants are persons of the same category from outside. If we stop to think about it, the sharing of category between foreigners and ancestors is a scandal in today's majoritarian nationalist states. In nationalist mythology, ancestors are the locals and ground all claims to exclusive native and majoritarian sovereignty. To say someone's ancestor was a foreigner is akin to insulting the person's mother in the terms of nativist nationalism. In the past, however, this was not an insult, but it was a compliment. The term Mapila in Tamil and Malayalam, if I'm not mistaken, means son-in-law. And son-in-law is an honored position treated like a prince. I think the mother-in-law cooks very special curry for you. Like that. So for Mapilas in Malabar, who traced ancestry to Arab traders and missionaries from Arabia, the honored sons-in-law become honored ancestors. Their wives become heads of matrilocal households called taravats, which hosted such foreign Arabs, married them, and inducted them as sons-in-law, Mapila. Nothing of this was insulting. Hosting, mixing, alliance with foreigners was a normal part of the ongoing process of reproduction, social and biological, of Malabar society. And we've heard Dr. Aziz say that PSMO College is at the forefront of welcoming international scholars. So to put it in a nutshell, the foreign was necessary to the reproduction of the self. I'll repeat that. The foreign is necessary, needed for the reproduction of the self. What this means is that in an inter-Asian frame, no society is an independent partial, as incomplete, as interdependent with other communities, whether close by or far away, whether of the same language or religion or not. If we think in European terms of the equation race equals language, equals religion, equals nation, equals state, these get scrambled up, like a sambar or something, in an Indian Ocean place like Malabar. There, persons may share a language, but be of a different religion, caste, or occupational category. Instead, one might share a religion with co-religionists far away who speak a different language. So if you're Muslim, you share religion with Malays in Southeast Asia, with Arabs in the Middle East. So this sort of scrambled up society, language, culture, and religion is at odds with the main line of European social theory, which thinks of a society as sui generis, independent and whole in its own right. And on that foundation of a theory of society, the Europeans built theories of government. The European project of social theory was to create a state for a society and vice versa. Montesquieu, a theorist of both law and society, thought of them as sharing a spirit that was linked to the place and its specific environment. He called it the spirit of the laws. For Montesquieu, what mattered was not so much the form of government, whether monarchy or republic. What mattered was the rule of law, even by a monarch. A king upholding law was not a tyrant or a despot. This sort of view set what we can call an aesthetic standard for social theory, in which different dimensions of social life went along with each other in an integrated whole. I mean, geography, environment, spirit, society, law, politics, economics, government, all meshed and correlated with one another in a synthetic or synchronic way. Comte, Durkheim, Marx, and the 20th century sociologists and anthropologists, inspired by them, elaborated upon such unitary views of society and social integration following Montesquieu. And many of our developing countries actually are the intellectual inheritors of this Enlightenment theory when we talk about national development and integration of society into one society as part of nation building. So this is all coming from European social theory. I submit that this kind of theory, national integration, society as a whole, does not fit a place like Malabar. It really doesn't. Nowhere did such a view of society, law, and government come from. Now, where did such a view of society, law, and government come from, and what were its consequences? We could go back to the 17th century Treaty of Westphalia, which established the principle of whose region, his religion. That is to say, religion and sovereignty were made isomorphic, to fit, following the faith of the prince. To end the wars of religion in which sovereigns transgress borders to protect that whole religionist in other people's wars. These were the 30 years religious wars in Europe. We could also go further afield to the 16th century colonization of the Americas by the West Atlantic rim states of England, France, Spain, Portugal, and Holland. Now, these were very small places on the west coast of the European continent. They engrossed American colonies, bulked up and became big monarchies in these states, creating large militaries, absolutisms, foreign wars, loss of blood and treasure, debt and inflation. They cast off the Pope. The point is that these international engagements and their disastrous consequences were what the Enlightenment social theorists reacted against. Enlightenment theories of society therefore repudiated international engagement in the sense of immoral colonial wars and an international economy of slavery, and set up instead a localized, national, whole, and smoothly integrated society as a sound basis or correlate for law and government. Yes, their principles were universal, the Republic of Letters international, but state and society were together solidly national. So when we pay attention to the conditions of production of European social theory, Enlightenment social theory, it becomes clear why the qualities of that theory do not fit the Indian Ocean situation. Instead of being national, localized, unitary, whole, integrated under the rule of one law, Indian Ocean societies were partial, interdependent with others nearby or far away, embedded in circulatory processes, involved with mobile foreigners over generations, and descended from ancestors who were not locals. So these are the qualities of the maritime arena which provide the key concepts for my thinking on Inter-Asia as a frame of analysis. Now, where European theory comes short is precisely where Al-Malibari's book, Gift of the Jihad Warriors, comes in, and why his book looks so multidisciplinary to us. So let's look at Malabari society through the eyes of Zainuddin Al-Malibari. So the full title of the book is Tuhfat al-Mujahideen fi Ba'd al-Ahwal al-Portugaliyin, Gift of the Mujahideen in some circumstances relating to the Portuguese. So Al-Malibari was a Muslim jurist in Malabar of Yemeni Arab descent. Some people believe third generation, and the family came from Ponan, and before Ponan they came from Kail Patinam, or Ma'bar. Ma'bar meaning the place of crossing of Yemenis to South Asia. His books in the manuals of Islamic law, such as Fath al-Mu'in, are published and read today as standard textbooks in East Africa, Yemen, India, Indonesia, Singapore, Malaysia, and elsewhere. If you want to know more, you can ask Abdul and Mahmoud Kuria. Al-Malibari, born probably in Bonani in Malabar, 1532, wrote his gift or Tuhfa to mobilize resistance against Portuguese depredations in the 1580s. Muslims from Arabia and elsewhere had been trading on the Malabar coast for centuries. Bonani, known as the Mecca of Malabar, was famed for its old Arab connections. Al-Malibari's family had arrived there in the 15th century. In the port cities of Malabar and the Coromandel coast, communities of Muslims had developed out of a history of international trade, conversion, marriage, migration, and population growth. Muslims maintained formal differences from non-Muslims, even as they engaged in broad social exchanges with them. And indeed, they flourished under the patronage of non-Muslim rulers. The ruler of Calicut, known as the Samudri Raja or ruler of the sea, was one such Hindu ruler who particularly valued his Muslim subjects and foreign Muslim traders, and benefited from fostering their international commerce. The Portuguese were intent on supplanting Muslims and their Mediterranean associates from the Venetians as carriers of valuable Indian products like pepper to Europe. They made alliances of their own, such as with the rulers of Cochin, and attacked Muslims and their local patrons and allies in port cities such as Calicut. So Al-Malibari's Tuhfa was an explicit response to the Portuguese. In it, he sets out the case against the Portuguese, detailing their military actions across the whole Indian Ocean, in particular those that targeted Muslims. He also presents arguments from Islamic law to oblige Muslims to fight the Portuguese. The opening chapter is essentially a legal treatise on jihad, the laws of war. Al-Malibari's legal case turns on the distinction between two kinds of obligation to fight infidels, one of sufficiency, fard kifaya, and the other a fundamental obligation, fard ain. When infidels dwell in their own countries, it is sufficient that a nominal few Muslims sally forth to do battle with them. However, when infidels invade Muslim lands, the obligation to fight them becomes absolute. Slaves need not ask permission from their masters to do so, nor husbands, wives, children, parents, or borrowers, lenders. The fundamental obligation to fight invaders, an obligation to God,